Welcome to this best of edition of the Vital Health Podcast. I'm Dwayne Schultes. Today we're featuring previous conversations I've had with Peter Kolchinsky and John LaMattina regarding the Inflation Reduction Act and the continuing ratcheting up of pressure upon the biopharmaceutical industry. Peter Kolchinsky is the managing partner at RA Capital Management. Peter has authored several critically acclaimed books, including The Great American Drug Deal and The Entrepreneur's Guide to a Biotech Startup. This podcast was first broadcast on January 17th, 2024. The Inflation Reduction Act treats large and small molecules differently, as we've all discussed. Successful small molecules now will have prices negotiated at 9 years after being in the market, and biologics, large molecules, will have their prices negotiated at 13 years. Now, as someone who does this and you're valuing assets, what does this mean for you and your decisions? What impact is IRA having on your investment decisions?
It's yet one more thing that we have to take into account when we evaluate any given project. We're always looking at, what's the toxicity profile in animals, what's the mechanism of action, what's the competitive landscape. There's so many questions that go into ultimately figuring out, should we invest in this? And functionally, any molecule that isn't going to get an exemption from that 9-year price negotiation. So if it's a molecule for disease of aging that is largely dependent on Medicare, and if it's not going to be for a single orphan indication that would get an exemption, and it's going to run squarely into that 9-year thing, it would be as if a company came to us and said, hey, will you fund my preclinical project? Oh, and by the way, when we launch, we will have only 9 years of patent exclusivity left. And of course, I know that for years, if we ever looked at a project and knew it would have only 9 years on the market before going generic, we would say, oh, that's too short. Right. So I already know what my decision is. 9 years is too short. Now, if somebody came to me with a phase 3 program that's largely de-risked and a low enough valuation, then 9 years might be fine, right? But if I'm starting from scratch, like at preclinical, and I know that I don't get to just enjoy the fruits of somebody else's, capital that was risked on all that and, write that off and buy into that at a low valuation phase 3, well, I'm not going to start that early project. So I would say that things like the 5-year data exclusivity that were in the Hatch-Waxman Act, right, those were consolation prizes and basically got to near the finish line with your patents expired. And it's like, all right, fine, I'll limp over the line. But nobody starts that race for too short a period on the market. 9 years is too short. 13 years is close enough to the 14-year average that has long prevailed that I don't think about the biologics side of the IRA as much.
Yeah, when we looked at our cohort, we saw 14, 15 years, same thing you just saw. How much value do you see being lost in that between 9 and 15 years? How much is on the table now that may be pulled out?
The average, I would say, is think of cutting the NPV roughly in half.
Half, 50%. Wow.
Maybe it's a 40% off or whatever it is. But the bottom line is you lose so much more than just the NPV on the one approved indication. You simply know that to the extent that you were going to do some indication expansion, anything like that, that's off the table. Right? It may take you several more years to figure out what other uses there are for the drug and get those into the label. And, if you get a new indication 3 or 4 years after launch, well, heck, that leaves you with only 5 years to enjoy the benefits of that second, third indication that comes in late. So all I know is 9 years has never been enough. I have not adapted my brain to think about how to make 9 years work. The easiest decision, therefore, is just say no. Move on to the next thing.
Exactly. Go for something that gives you more value, more certainty, because it's already risky enough, right?
That's right. I think what worries me is not just this 9-year punch in the face. It's the question of why is the public punching the drug industry in the face? Where is this coming from? And is it going to really stop at 9? Well, of course not. When I'm projecting out what kind of environment will I be launching any preclinical drug that I'm funding today, what kind of environment is it going to be launching into 9 years, 10 years from now when it's coming to market? Can I really be so sure that it won't be worse than this 9 and 13 thing? No. And so you got to fight just to maintain the status quo of merely 9 and 13. I'd sure feel better if we can get the public to realize its mistake and demonstrate that it recognizes its mistake and that it didn't intend to punch innovation in the face by fixing 9 and making it 13. That would make me feel better that we've learned from this and that we're going to achieve affordability in a different way, not through price controls, but insurance reform. The pharma industry is never going to be able to confidently invest in innovation and continue making medicines that are only temporarily expensive and then become generic. It will never be able to do this as long as there are out-of-pocket costs for obviously appropriate treatments. So we've got to fix affordability through insurance reform and really rally the public around this idea that no one's faking cancer to joyride chemo. Make that a tagline. There should be really like ads out there. Like, we all paid for it. Patients already paid for that drug in the form of premiums. There should be a campaign that OOP means out of premium. There's so many ways to direct our direct-to-consumer advertising talents as an industry in order to ultimately channel the public's outrage where it belongs. Public should be outraged about insurance design in this country. Now, if out-of-pockets were zero for appropriately prescribed drugs, what that would simply mean is we are all now bearing the costs of all of healthcare out of our premiums. Of course, nobody wants to be taken for a ride, whether it's for $1,000 out of pocket or for a penny. And so I'm not suggesting that just because now we would be paying out of premiums, that drugs shouldn't be worth it, or shouldn't be worth it to society. I would argue that Congress kind of understands that the reason we get value from medicines is because they can go generic. They're manufactured goods that are displacing services. They've long gotten that. You can see it in the way that Hatch-Waxman made sure that drugs went generic. It created the ANDA path, but also made sure that the incentives were adequate to keep them being invented. So added the 5 years of patent term restoration to make sure that the average time a drug had on the market before going generic was about 14 years, right? Patents are 20 years long, but you burn a lot of that up, in clinical development. Yeah. And so Congress is like, all right, let's make sure you get up to 14 years. And that's why the average has been around that point. And then the ACA came along, Medicare Part D came along. Those things improved insurance, reduced out-of-pockets. But at the same time as the ACA, they passed the Biosimilars Act to try to get biologics to abide by the intent of Hatch-Waxman. That didn't quite work out because biologics aren't interchangeable, and some things like gene therapies, you can't even develop a biosimilar of that. And so along comes the IRA, and it sets an out-of-pocket cap for seniors. That's good. $2,000 is welcome. Smoothing out of pockets, that's welcome. You shouldn't get hit with the whole deductible all in January. Smooth that out over the year to help solve for affordability. And, the 13-year price control on biologics, I get it. I would have preferred that it be 14 or 15, but whatever. That's making sure that these drugs that kind of don't really fall off a generic cliff the way small molecules do, that they too become public goods. I get it. So for the most part, if you think about all the kind of policy we've gotten over the years, it has abided by what I've called, and now other people call, the biotech social contract. Insurance for affordability, and then making sure drugs go essentially generic, becoming expensive, to make sure that we all as a society get value for our money. That's what I think it really takes in order to keep driving innovation forward. Now, how do you get the public to get it? Right?
Yeah.
Well, I would argue that the public doesn't have to get anything at the moment other than how outrageous out-of-pocket costs are. First, get that off their mind. Then later, when they're not worried about getting hit with an out-of-pocket when they're sick and vulnerable, then we can find out what would it take to get the public to be inspired by how a little bit of the money that they pay every month towards premiums is going towards driving all of this innovation.
If you look at, say, okay, we've got an out-of-pocket cap now, and we both agree that's great. Okay, fantastic. But we're also now, there's PBM reform that just came out of the House of Representatives yesterday. So now we're going to be putting transparency on rebates. And for those folks who are listening who don't know what a rebate is, that's money that the company pays back to the pharmaceutical benefit manager. That's revenue that gets back for placement, so they get a percentage of that revenue. The PBMs get it to list that as part of their formulary on the insurance.
It's like a retroactive discount.
Yeah, exactly. We're cramming those down now, and that just leaves the premiums out there. Now we're talking about freezing premiums or putting into law the inability to raise premiums. Now, A plus B plus C has to equal D here. And the problem is, if we're putting all these constraints in, the only thing you've got then is what they do in Europe, which is access management and restrictions on access.
Yeah.
Are you concerned that that's where we're going to start to end up?
What we are seeing here in written large is a conflict between the idea of investing and managing a budget.
Yeah.
So what we spend on hospitals generally does not drive innovation. If you just spend on hospitals to keep treating people, unless they've got new drugs or new diagnostics or new medical devices, a hospital will keep doing the same thing that it's doing, and its costs will over time only go up, generally speaking, because land and labor only goes up. And as the population ages and you've got inverted demographic trends, it's going to be only more expensive to staff hospitals. So we're just paying this rent to hospitals. The only thing that could possibly allow us to spend less on Alzheimer's, for example, than we're doomed to spend on nursing homes and hospitals and all that, is if we innovate our way into preventing the progression of Alzheimer's, to allow people to keep their mental faculties about them, to be able to take care of themselves, and therefore remain at least productive, if not doing work. I mean, oftentimes people are retired by that point, but at least do the work of looking after yourself, right? And so you keep somebody out of the hospital, you keep them out of a nursing home, and it may be that the incentives that you need to offer in order to elicit that kind of innovation are higher than what you are currently spending on Alzheimer's. This isn't unique to Alzheimer's. When people talk about we need new antibiotics, well, in fact, we don't need them right now. We just need them in the future in case some crazy drug-resistant bugs emerge, right? And so what is Congress doing? It's debating passing the Pasteur Act to create billions of dollars of near-term incentives for companies who create new antibiotics because we need to just stick them on a shelf and have them just in case in the future. So this is an example of the government taking a long-range view and saying it is worth stressing our budget a little bit to create something that will pay itself off and save us tremendous expense in the future. So it is justifiable to borrow to the extent that the government, goes into debt. It is borrowing against its future self and will realize the savings later, whether it's averting needing to build thousands of more nursing homes or averting some sort of pandemic from a drug-resistant bug. We will ultimately save ourselves a lot of money because we invested in the preventative measures now. That's the kind of thinking we need to preserve. Our government is capable of taking that long-range view. Like for climate change, I met with an economist. The spouse of one of my colleagues here is an economist with the EPA. I asked her, how far out do your models go? Take a guess how far their models go.
50 years.
300.
300 years.
300 years.
That's a big model.
I know. I mean, Excel or Google, I guess, can handle it.
I guess.
And they use a discount rate of about 2%. And so when you build a 300-year model and you discount it only 2%, you see that, wow, there's a lot of cost and suffering that could come from whatever's going to happen with the climate based on the predictions. And yeah, it's worth coming up with some incentives in the near term to prime the pump on all kinds of technologies to try to bend the climate change curve. Well, how's Alzheimer's any different? Go ahead, build a 300-year model of Alzheimer's. These models are not like abstract academic models. These are the models that govern what our children are going to actually experience. I've got a 4-year-old son and a 10-year-old daughter. This is their reality. And I do care about them in their old age. I'd like to see a model that tries to avert Alzheimer's instead of just saying, well, we're not going to spend that money and who knows what's going to happen to costs way out there. It's like, oh, I know. If, it's either you are going to spend a ton of money building nursing homes, or if you insist on not spending any more on healthcare than you spend now, then you're going to be turning away people with Alzheimer's. You're going to be saying no.
You're going to be restricting access. That's your only option.
And they will what? They will rot in their own homes. And, people badly want to stay in their own homes. They know that if they can't, they will go to a nursing home. That's where they will end up. What happens when you're not going to a nursing home? What's the alternative? They call 911 really often. Sometimes there are people who can't get into their bed. So they call 911 just so somebody helps them into their bed. That's crazy. So imagine when we're not spending money on the EMTs anymore, when there's not enough. So now nobody shows up. This is our future. So when you say no to innovation to try to allow people to keep their health, preserve their health span, and take care of themselves as much as possible, then you're going to pay the cost. The question is, in what form? Will it be a lot more money building nursing homes, or will it be in suffering and the moral decay of our society as we let our aging population just suffer?
And what's really pernicious about this, Peter, if you look at where innovation has been going the last 3 years. We're actually starting to see therapies that aren't just masking symptoms, that are actually working at preventing the onset of Alzheimer's. We're actually starting to get there. And what's nice now, if you were at CTAD, the big Alzheimer's conference that happens annually, you saw that, okay, now that we have this drug, we see actually non-responders and responders related to insulin receptors in the brain. So there you go. There's another channel we can go after for medication. These are probably going to have to be both combo treatments and probably small molecules to get past, eventually, small molecules to cross.
It's the brain. It's a lot easier to get small molecules in the brain.
And we've just disincentivized that.
Yes, we did.
We just disincentivized that with IRA.
And look, when I talk with people in Congress, I get the impression that there are some people who know that this is a flawed policy. For example, Scott Peters, he's a congressman from San Diego, and he was instrumental in fending off HR3. And he proposed the Scott Peters bill, which actually would have been a really smart policy that would have given drugs their initial patent length and then imposed Medicare negotiations. So ballpark 15 years or so, that would have been great.
But that, right? Does anybody not want that deal right now?
You know what? That deal was instrumental in, frankly, averaging HR3. You take the average of the Scott Peters bill with HR3, and unfortunately what we got was not 13 years for all drugs, but this strange compromise where it's 13 for biologics and 9 for small molecules. Scott Peters, at a recent testimony, in fact, I think where Steve Potts testified, he said no bill like this is ever going to be perfect. You pass it, you approximate the kind of policy that you want, then over time you fix what needs fixing, right? Now, you won't get a lot of Democrats who are going to say that publicly, but the fact that you get any Democrats that say that publicly ultimately gives me hope. There have been other Democrats who have said that, off the record. Yeah. I remember one exchange that I had with a fairly senior Democrat who said, hey, don't worry, like this will get fixed. This is obviously not what was intended. And I said, well, it's really important for me to know when, because I got to tell you, like, I'm already not funding these programs, and I've defunded some programs, and we've told our companies that have platforms that could do any number of things, stay away from any diseases of aging where you're going to be heavily dependent on Medicare. And the trouble is that if I say, oh, you know what, let's just go at risk. Let's go pursue those programs because I just trust that the government will fix this, then everybody watching will say, see, it didn't do anything to innovation. And therefore, the impetus, the evidence that you're looking for that this 9-year penalty is harmful, you won't actually see it, because we all will keep investing, trusting that you'll fix it. So we have to take it seriously and act like you won't fix it in order for you to have the evidence that you seem to need and want and ask for why it should be fixed. And it's perverse, right?
Yeah, and the problem as well, Peter, is eventually we're not paying the price now. Okay, it's not today yet because the maximum fair price is not in. You and I, we've done the math. We know that, in a few years, and where that goes, it depends if it's a rebate or if it's on the premiums. We don't know exactly yet, depending on the drug and the negotiation. But there's going to be $4 or $5 billion of Eliquis that disappears. Whoosh, gone.
Yeah.
Puff. It's gone. Okay. Well, where it's not going is to pay you guys off to make you whole for your investments.
Well, look, it is not the actual $5 billion that Eliquis won't earn that is going to, therefore, reduce the industry's ability to do R&D. Because technically speaking, there's lots of cases, for example, in a disease where there's no money being made by any drug, where we come up with the funding because we believe there will be enough money.
Okay.
And so it's by watching how Congress treats Eliquis today that we infer how any of our drugs that we're funding today will be treated.
So you're picking up the signals, exactly.
So imagine God came down, all right? And I can't think of anybody with more integrity that we would believe more than God, and I say this as somebody who is agnostic.
Fair enough.
And
so you're already surrendering the belief that yes, he does exist.
So
congratulations.
For the purposes of this discussion, let's say Peter, that God exists.
We just tabled and accepted.
He, she, they. I've been reading Percy Jackson books with my daughter, so maybe it's the Greek gods.
Fair
but
enough.
In any case, the bottom line is God comes down and says, all right, we're going to do a one-time thing. We're going to price control all drugs that currently exist, all of them. If they were launched a year ago, 2 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, they're all being nationalized. But I promise you, in exchange for that, we're going to lower out-of-pocket costs, and never again will this ever happen. So you can go ahead and use all your inferences about market-based pricing for all the projects that you are, funding, and for the rest of time, like this will never happen again. Would there still be R&D? And the answer is yes, because it's the confidence that, that'll never happen again, and out-of-pocket costs are lower. Like, yeah, let's invest. It means that society will come up with more funding through venture capital, right, in order to fund these projects. There won't be pharma companies. It'll be tedious to rebuild sales or marketing teams and whatever. But the bottom line is you don't actually need the drugs that are on the market today to fund the R&D that is going on today. It's convenient. It is absolutely convenient that the companies that are really good at doing this continue to exist. There's a continuity of expertise that comes from that.
It's not called economies of scale. It's called economies of scope, technically.
Yeah.
And these companies, because they have these infrastructures there, they can very efficiently pivot to certain assets at a very, very hard to beat cost. That's really what that boils down to.
That's right. Now, of course, the reason why this little thought experiment doesn't work is that nobody can make that promise.
Not even God?
I mean, I'll believe it when I meet God.
When he or she shows up. Yes.
I'll see. All right. There'll be a lot of doubt about the wisdom of the God that came down and said, this is the policy. Like, I see everything going wrong in the world, but this is the thing I'm going to do. Right. Anybody who thinks that that's a good idea, that's the solution for how to achieve affordability and balance the country's budget when branded drugs make up a little over 1% of GDP, like to pick on that. It's like, no, this God's coming back, right? like I don't believe him that they'll never do it again. And
well, that is the end of the New Testament. It does say that, Peter. So
that's right. That's right. The resurrection of the anti-pharma God. And so I worry about anybody who says, "Oh, it's just a one-time thing." It's like it's not. The way you treat Eliquis, the way you're going to treat Ibrance, the way you're going to treat all these drugs is the way you will treat my drug someday, if not worse.
You and I were on a panel last month in the House Budget Committee.
Yeah.
And we were with CBO. And what was really interesting in the course of that meeting, in the questioning that you and I were sort of putting forward, sort of a bizarre tag team.
The bear conversation.
Yes, exactly. We finally had CBO admit on the record in this meeting that they hadn't considered indications at all in their assessment. We would see switching out of some drug classes. And when push came to shove, we got them to admit that, they're probably switching out of the Medicare age population. Now, there were several Congress people in that meeting whose mouths at that point basically hit the floor when the ramifications of that came about. How do we get the general public to realize what's happening? CBO saying, you're only going to lose 1% on aggregate, but in fact, you're seeing huge switches away from the over 65 population in drug discovery.
Ever since the CBO scored the IRA, and there's sort of the primary scoring they do, just like what will the impact be in the next 10 years, and frankly, not much, because when I stop planting seeds, it'll take you most of that 10 years to realize, like,
where's the food?
Where's all the food, right? Like when it takes that long to grow. So in a 10-year time frame, defunding innovation, removing incentives for innovation, like you won't see that impact. Congress can ask the CBO to look out further. And so this is more of a secondary analysis. And so they asked them to look out like 30 years. And indeed, you ought to see what happens when I've stopped planting all kinds of seeds, like small molecules for heart failure. Done. No way, right? Unless it's an orphan heart failure. I was surprised when they said, it would barely move the needle. I see a bigger oversight there than even the couple things that you said. Maybe there's a drug that previously would have been approved for colorectal cancer and lung cancer, and these are large indications. There's no orphan exemption. Maybe they would instead be approved for a subset of colorectal cancer that would still be orphan. Well, in terms of number of drugs, that's one. So you didn't lose that drug. But there's a big difference between getting a drug approved that is indicated for the treatment of many cancers that can help hundreds of thousands of patients every year, and a drug that will end up being used for an orphan indication, right? And so that's what they pointed out, like, indeed, we did not really consider the utility of the drugs that would squeak by via the orphan exemption. But there's something else that they really didn't consider I can't really blame them entirely because this is a group of nonpartisan economists that are trying to get the math right, and they're going off of academic literature. Academics, they study investors like we're this strange species, right? And this sort
in
of
a cage, lab animals,
Well, more like in the wild. Where I'm not in anybody's cage, not yet. But
metaphorically, Peter,
yeah.
metaphorically.
But no, they study us, like I'm a bear, right? This is the bear analogy that I used with the congressman. It's like, what will the bear do next? And like, where does the bear sleep? What does the bear eat? What will get the bear to make these medicines? How many will the bear make? And I'm like, well, I'm a bear. You could just ask me. I'll tell you like what I do and why I do it and how I think. What the CBO basically said is like, well, the government tends to cut, $50 billion per year off of the drug industry's, revenues. Without regard for how profitable is the $50 billion, when, after launching the drug, are you cutting it, right? And so I said, like, look, if you're going to cut 100 pounds of food out of a bear's diet, it doesn't matter much if you cut like 100 pounds of grasses and berries in the summertime or whatever from a bear's diet. It's not a lot of calories and it's well before the bear hibernates. But if you're going to cut 100 pounds of American fatty salmon from the bear's diet as the bear fattens up for hibernation, like that bear may not make it through the winter. And so all you did was just said 100 pounds is 100 pounds, except it's not. And $50 billion cut from seemingly $1.5 trillion of global drug revenue. Well, it's like, well, wait a second. I don't think any of us are incentivized by the revenues generated by some like Spanish topical steroid cream company that sells steroid creams in Spain. Those are irrelevant. When you strip away a ton of this irrelevant revenue, you get down to about $800 billion or so of revenues. Then you do the whole gross to net adjustment in the US. That shaves another $200 billion off. And so at the end of the day, you're left with something on the order of $650 billion of global revenue for branded drugs, of which 250 or 300 billion is ex-US, which ex-US is a very big region. It's the whole world minus just the US, which is 5%, right? So imagine that you're generating about $350 billion in the US and you're generating about $300 billion in the whole rest of the world. That is a lot of sales and marketing and manufacturing and everything like that. So those ex-US revenues are really low margin. If you cut $50 billion off that, I wouldn't care. It already barely contributes to our profits. So we showed them a model. We built out this slide deck. Step by step, we stripped away the irrelevant revenues. Then we basically showed that all ex-US revenues add up to only about 18% or so of the net present value of a newly approved drug. And then we pointed out the US is 82% of that NPV. And if you were to cut $50 billion off of just old drugs, if you were to whack any drug that was more than like 14 years, fine, more than 13 years on the market, that's so far off in my NPV curve, it doesn't really move my NPV all that much when I'm making a phase one investment. But if you're going to take that $50 billion off of years 9 through 14 or so, like in that zone, that's pretty impactful to my net present value. So all these academics that had studied what's called the elasticity of innovation, the amount of innovation you get relative to how much society pays, all they did was correlate revenues and number of drugs. But they never bothered to quantify the dimension of profitability, nor add in the time discount component in order to get to NPV. As soon as you do that, you realize that there's a huge difference in how you extract $50 billion from the marketplace. And the way that the IRA did it is the most toxic way that you can.
Because it's the drugs that are driving the most outsized profitability for the sector.
It's the market that is contributing the most profit, and you're taking it out of the early years that the patent system has intended to be the incentive for innovation. You can take it off the old drugs. You can take it off hard off the old drugs. The IRA only has a mandatory 35% discount 13 years after biologics launch. Well, yeah, but there's no floor to it. So I'm already going to assume that the government's going to take the maximal discount.
Yeah, of course.
So why don't you just, in your scoring, which, by the way, the CBO does not assume that the price is going to go lower than 35. They just assume like, well, if the mandatory discount is 35, industry will magically have some sort of leverage to keep it at the minimum. And it's like, no, they won't. There's no leverage. They're going to get all their profits taken. So if it helps you with your scoring, go ahead and change 9 to 13 for small molecules, but after 13 years, change the mandatory discount from 35% to 42%. That's it. That's all it would take to basically make the score neutral. You can even go deeper than that. Go ahead and knock it down by an extra like 40% if you'll just lower out-of-pocket costs for patients even further. So that is such a great trade for us, right? To give up these distant profits that barely matter to us when we're making these investments in R&D in exchange for smoothing, greasing the front end of the NPV curve that would also reduce people's outrage over not being able to afford medicines that they badly want.
John LaMattina was president of Pfizer Global Research and Development and ran an international team of over 13,000 scientists and professionals. He has authored several books, including the highly acclaimed Pharma and Profits, Balancing Innovation, Medicine, and Drug Prices. This podcast was first broadcast on March 27th, 2024. Last year when we met, we were discussing the theoretical impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act as it was just coming into focus. Now the drugs have been selected. Companies are receiving their maximum fair prices from CMS for negotiations. How do you think companies are going to respond?
Oh, I think companies have responded in a variety of different ways. People have pretty much wrapped their heads around the fact that there's going to be less revenue.
Yeah.
All these government analyses that says, no, over 10-year periods, there might be one or two fewer drugs. It's just garbage. And on the other hand, they say, well, if it's going to save $700 billion in spend, you got to take $75 billion less in R&D investment. You can't eliminate $75 billion in R&D investment and not expect to have less productivity. That's a fact. Some unfortunate things are happening. So in the case of my company, former company, Pfizer, let me say at the outset, I had a 30-year career at Pfizer, but I left Pfizer almost 15 years ago. So I know a lot about the company still, but I don't have necessarily the allegiance. That's my disclaimer here. But Pfizer announced, based on decreased revenues, a $4 billion cut in spending across the board for the whole company. That's a lot of money, and that includes a lot. And they're not the only ones who have announced price cuts. J&J just last week announced the closing of a research site out in California to save money. So a lot of this is now starting to echo through the industry in terms of there's going to be less money for R&D. But that's just research. Now, the strange thing about the IRA is that they are only allowing a small molecule drugs without cost containment for 9 years, whereas large molecule drugs, biologics, injectables, et cetera, are 13 years. Well, that has led to a variety of theoretical changes in terms of pipelines. It was theoretical a year ago when we talked. Now it's real. So let's start with venture capitalists. Venture capitalists are now starting to advise companies they're working with to say, you know what, you've got a portfolio here. You've got a lot of small molecule stuff, less large molecule stuff. You ought to start rebalancing your portfolio to do more large molecule stuff because you get a return on investment longer that way. And then larger molecules tend to be more expensive than small molecule pills going forward.
And there's less substitution as well because biosimilars are harder to make.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when a day a small molecule goes off patent, boy, you've got generics in immediately. Biosimilars, it takes longer because they're not done the same way. They're done synthesized in cells or organisms, et cetera. But another interesting change as a result of the IRA is a lot of times with large molecules, you would say, okay, we have 2 or 3 potential indications we can use this drug for. We're going to bring it out first for the smaller indication because we'll get it out there, we'll get it used, we'll start generating revenues for that, and then we'll bring on the larger indications later on. Well, now what's happening? Our company says, well, we're not going to do that anymore because once we get the compound out from one indication, the clock starts.
Absolutely. That IRA clock starts ticking the moment, even if it's a tiny indication.
Exactly. And so as a result, companies are saying, we're going to wait and maybe launch it for a couple of things at the same time. And so we'll wait a couple of 3 years. And you may say, so what's the big deal? What's the big deal? It's there for 2 or 3 years. But that compound could have benefited the patients it was designed for. And smaller indications tend to be rare diseases, more niche, small cancers, for example, that you say, we just can't afford to do that now.
If you look at Keytruda, the first 2 years it was launched, now it's huge, monster drug, fantastic drug, really. People are alive because of it. It's so good with solid tumors. But if you look at some of those first years, 75 million the first year, 500 million the second year. It took a while they expanded the portfolio and got more indications before it became the big monster it is now.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
Perfect example. Now, if you had a drug of that ilk, you would wait till you had 2 or 3 of the indications lined up before you would launch.
You said something, VCs are changing their behavior. CBO published something right before Christmas, which caught my eye. And they said they saw no evidence since the passage of IRA that, we haven't seen any action that's really changed. Man, we've seen no impact since the law was passed.
I saw that same article, and it strikes you about how little government officials know about drugs. Of course you're not going to see anything now because everybody's pipeline is moving along. You have compounds in phase 3 that in the next couple of 3 years will eventually get approved and launch in phase 2 too. Nobody's going to drop those compounds.
Yeah.
You've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in these. Those you got to get out there. It's earlier in the pipeline. It's in the discovery portfolios where changes are occurring, dramatic changes are occurring that won't affect things today or tomorrow, but will down the line.
When I read that, I had some pithy comments probably. Let's look at deal flow under $2 billion. Let's look at early stage, mid stage stuff. And when you pull that data set, John, what you see is huge deal flow peaking in Q2 of 2021 when Build Back Better was introduced. And all of a sudden you see this drop, 70% drop in IPOs, 50% drop in VC deals. Essentially what we see happening is big companies, they're pulling the big trees, they're making lumber, these trees are grown, but you're not seeing half the saplings being planted now, 10 years up, and there's not going to be enough trees to buy.
So truth to that, I think also that what happened was credit also dried up, the amount of money to invest in funds. And so that made a difference there as well. But I want to make one point before we move on from this, and that is the insanity about this medically is unbelievable because larger molecules are expensive to administer. You normally have to go to a doctor's office or a clinic or whatever, and you go to a doctor's office to get injected once a month, twice a month. That adds cost to the overall healthcare system, as opposed to going to a pharmacy and getting a pill and taking that. As you shift away from pills, you're going to generate more costs because more large molecules are coming, which would be great drugs, important drugs, and treat diseases, but they'll be more expensive to begin with, and they'll be more expensive to administer as well. So it's just all backwards.
Obviously, large molecules have certain applications which are very good, but one of them is not neurology, for example. Crossing the blood-brain barrier is quite difficult. Hard to get things in the brain,
exactly. Right.
Yeah. I was invited to participate as a member of the Healthcare Task Force of the House Budget Committee with Director Swaggart of CBO. Peter Kolchinsky and I were both on this group. What was not discussed and what CBO finally admitted, they hadn't looked at indications in their analysis, so you don't know the disease prevalence by age. And we're like, when you say substitution, are you then implying that these companies are going to be not targeting Medicare, where they're going to be price controlled? Is this what you're implying? Well, yeah, we do see substitution, and there was some mortified looks like, oh, wait a minute.
I hadn't thought about that.
Hadn't thought about that. So, in their modeling, there's an assumption that companies may substitute, i.e., leave Medicare and discovery. But
certainly that's another thing that will impact discussions on what you want to work on. Do you want to work on drugs that primarily would be for people under the age of 65 that you won't have high Medicare payments on because it's just not used for them?
So you're at PureTech Health. Are you considering IRA now as part of your decision?
We haven't gotten to that point yet. I think that you have to have PureTech Health is relatively small portfolio of about 10 or 11 compounds. Going forward, it might be something we'll look into, but we tend to be opportunistic. I think where this really has impact are the bigger companies. With a portfolio of 100 programs, 120, the Pfizers and Mercks and Lilly's that work on in discovery, at least 100, 120 programs. And I can envision discussions going on with the commercial colleagues who will say, well, looking at this, what percentage of these are large molecule programs and what percentage are small molecule programs? And if the balance is 60, 65% small versus large, I say,
you're going to flip it.
Can you flip that? Yeah. Can you rebalance this? It just makes more sense. And to be honest, in discovery, it doesn't cost more to do a program for a large molecule than a small molecule. In some ways, the discovery part can cost less. Development, making large bulk supplies for clinical, that'll be different. That'll be more expensive. But in the early stage, it's a wash.
PitchBook, according to their data, 38% of all VCs stopped deal making in 2023. I mean, that is a stunning number. Are you seeing a rebound or are you still seeing it depressed? What's your...
So I think right now what's happened, it's become a buyer's market with the VCs being the buyers. And that is 5-6 years ago, there'd be a frenzy for a new startup company that had some interesting technology or an interesting early stage compound that people would bid on and invest in these things before you even had any toxicology data or before you had any clinical data. Now what's happening is people are holding their powder and waiting to say, well, let's wait and see how well this hits certain key stages. Let's see if it shows the necessary efficacy at this stage, at this stage, at this stage. Now, what you can see is maybe this is shifted, and once more of these startup companies get to that stage, you'll see the money coming back in. I think the VCs will feel a whole lot more comfortable. And it's not just them, it's big pharma and mid-sized pharma. Once it all shifts, maybe you'll see more deals coming in. There seems to be some movement now, so I think that's starting to happen.
But what you're outlining then is there's going to be still tighter liquidity. There's just not going to be as much activity as we had.
Hopefully that will change. I tend to be optimistic, so we'll see.
We're seeing 60% drops in leasing of lab space, drops in employment, 15,000, 20,000 fewer jobs in the biotech sector in the last quarter alone. I mean, it's really bad. Are the politicians starting to get hip to this? Hey, wait a minute, we may have thrown the golden goose out with the golden eggs?
I don't think politicians care.
No?
So politicians care. I'll give you a little bit of my theory as to why that's happening in a second. But politicians, 80+% of this country wanted drug prices controlled. Nobody really cared about hospital prices controlled because a lot of people don't see that. When they go to a CVS, they actually see they're spending more out of pocket or their insurance companies are more of a copay, et cetera. Doesn't happen as much when you go to get hospital tests, et cetera. Those all tend to be covered. They don't see that. They don't see the inflation going up. But everybody wanted, let's beat down the pharmaceutical industry. It's somewhat dated now, but I show quotes of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump on the only thing they've ever agreed upon, and that was Trump in the first couple of years when he was president said, we got to get the drug companies under control. They're getting away with murder. And Bernie said, exactly right. They are getting away. Literal murder. People can't afford their drugs, et cetera, et cetera. I'm thinking, oh, God. When you've got that much firepower against you, of course you're going to pay for all of this with price controls. And I think that's a lot of what's happened. It's a different phenomenon, I think, with the layoffs in biotech. What's happening in the biotech industry in Boston are the early stage companies that may be a one-drug company or a two-drug company, early stage biotech, who now are getting to the point where they've got to fund clinical trials. In the past, they might go to an IPO to get their money for clinical trials.
IPO market's dead.
That's right. So that's right. So as a result, you've got to survive. You've got to get these compounds to market to generate revenues. So you got to do the clinical trials, which are way more expensive than discovery work. So what do they do? To conserve cash, to expand their runway 1, 2, 3 years out, to get these compounds across the finish line, they're laying off the early discovery folks. And that's when you're seeing the jobs that are going, that tends to be where they're going right now. Will that rebound? If a company is successful, then they have to go back now, and unless they get acquired, to go back in and now rebuild a pipeline in order to have stuff to be able to bring through.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's part of what's happening there.
We're seeing larger valuations in cardiovascular. We're seeing a move out of the over 65. I mean, there have been a couple cancer acquisitions that are people who are naive and say, see, everything's fine. We're seeing a lot of traction in cardiovascular, John. It's partying like it's 1999 again before Medicare Part D, you know?
Yeah. So a lot of what's going on in cardiovascular tends to be in getting people medicines before they get into frank congestive heart failure.
Yeah.
That stuff starts in the 40s and 50s and things like that. So trying to move down, you got to have a broad coverage there. So that doesn't surprise me.
Given the fact that also then puts the life cycle outside of Medicare as far as the time frame.
As what we've talked about, sure.
One final thing there. Do you honestly feel that in cities like Boston, there will be a rebound, or do you see this constantly just staying down for a while? I mean,
That's a great question.
How's this going to happen?
I'm hoping there'll be a rebound. It's interesting, these obesity drugs, which are not necessarily for people over 65, right?
Yeah,
this is going all the way down, is having an enormous effect on people's psyches and thinking and investments. And so if you've got programs that can have an application like Wegovy and Mounjaro and things like that, These drugs are also showing that they impact heart disease, they reduce heart disease, and they're good for diabetes. They may be useful for addictions. People seem to drink less.
Alcohol addiction,
exactly.
yes.
People seem to drink less, and they seem to have an impact on what's called NASH, or now MASH, basically fatty livers, which obese people, and even people who aren't obese, can get very fatty livers, which have severe downstream consequences. And so there's a lot of excitement generated around there, and so a lot of money is coming in to invest in companies doing that sort of thing, sort of like a rebirth of metabolic diseases in a lot of ways, which had been played out for a while when you had all the great statins and things like that. But now there's been a renaissance. So I think I'm optimistic. I think this will come back. I think more of it. But there'll be less money to invest in R&D than there was. I'm hoping we're at an 8 now, and it'll start coming back up.
If you look at Novo Nordisk's performance, right now the market cap of Novo Nordisk is larger than the entire GDP of Denmark. I mean,
Exactly.
It's absolutely mad.
And Lilly has done extremely, extremely well with their drug. These are becoming $15, $16, $20 billion drugs. So I think that's doing very, very well. And you never know what the next hot area is going to be, and that'll generate a lot more money to invest in R&D.
So not only do we have IRA, not only do we have the Congressional Budget Office and all that going on.
Let's talk margin rights.
Let's talk margin rights in the wonderful Biden administration. Under the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, they released a draft interagency guidance framework for considering the exercise of margin rights under Bayh-Dole. There's a lot of language there.
Margin rights is basically now the government saying, you know what, through the NIH, we invest in all sorts of R&D, and we get this great stuff, and we patent it, but then we give the patents out to these big pharmaceutical companies, and then all they do is manufacture it and charge outrageous prices. Why aren't Americans getting a fair deal on all this money they invest in all these drugs that are coming out?
Which they invent. John, you didn't do anything at Pfizer, did
That's
you?
Right,
you just bought a patent and then that was
now,
it, just licensed to print money.
Lo and behold, your group, Vital Transformation, did a study. Now, what are the facts, Dwayne? Share with me what the data shows.
Well, interestingly enough, there's a new tool called the Lens, and I have to give a shout out to our colleague Gwen O'Loughlin, who was the one who figured this out because she was a grad student at the time finishing some post-work at the University of Wisconsin. She worked with the law library, and they worked with this new tool called the Lens. And what the Lens was able to do for one of the first times is you could put the government interest statement that you are required by federal law to have if you get funding from the federal government to do research under Bayh-Dole. You have to say, hey, there are rights associated to a government license to this and blah, blah, blah. So that goes in. There's a specific language. So Gwen designed an algorithm using this tool called the Lens. And for the first time, we were able to search millions of patents for the government interest statement. What did we find? Well, first off, one drug does not have one patent. There are usually, as you know, John, their mechanism of action, their composition of matter. There will be several different patents.
Different diseases, sure.
Exactly. So you'll have a panoply of patents based on various different formulations, time release, et cetera, just because you have a mechanism of action or a novel therapy that a scientist has invented, say, at one of our fine universities, that does not get you a drug. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in there. And what we found actually is you need to have, one, all of the patents, and two, they would then all need to have this government interest statement. And lo and behold, when we looked at 363 drugs, we found 5.
Well, this is over what period of time?
10 years.
10 years? 5 drugs.
Over 10 years.
So we're talking about legislation, spending time on marching in for maybe 5 drugs.
Yes, and it's not really 5 drugs, John, because 2 of the drugs are imaging agents of nominal value. One of the companies sold for $1.1 million, and in VC back of the envelope math, lick your thumb, that means $100,000 a year of revenue. Okay, that's a nominal asset. There are 2 cancer drugs. We saw no sales for the last 6 years on either. They've been withdrawn from the market. The one drug that everyone's been pitching their tent on is Xtandi, which is the cancer drug. A drug that has been marched in on or had petitions filed on it 6 times, just that one drug. And the reason why it would appear is it's one of the only drugs you can literally march in upon. Now, 10% of the cohort did have a government interest statement, so there is government research there that's patentable. What's been intriguing, John, is it was very controversial when we first put it out, and we've had virtually no pushback on this at all. In fact, all the people who've been known critics are backpedaling furiously now and say, well, actually, oh yeah, sorry, just kidding.
So there's no doubt that the research that the government does and sponsors, not just at the NIH, but around the country, is important for all sorts of reasons. It helps you understand diseases and get a better handle on things. But the fact of the matter is, what the NIH and this research does will provide a hypothesis saying, you know what, if you were to block enzyme XYZ, you might have a new treatment for depression. Let's pick that out. Okay, that's an interesting thing, but now you need a company or companies, because usually a bunch of companies will look at that and say, well, maybe there's something to it, and go in and do all the background research, which takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years, to try and see if you can come up with a compound that would actually do that, would actually block that enzyme. And then it is the biopharmaceutical industry that tests this hypothesis, that takes a compound and does the clinical trials, which cost tens of millions of dollars. And the further you go in the clinic, the more you spend to prove or disprove that medical hypothesis. So what the early stage stuff is great. And I liken it to running the first mile of a marathon. You don't run the first marathon, you're done.
Yeah,
you don't go.
I win.
But each successive mile gets harder and harder. It costs more resources to the body, etc. And so it's important and it's needed. But if you want marching rights, it's not going to be anywhere near what people had thought to be. Now, just last week, a bipartisan letter was written by a bunch of senators and representatives to Joe Biden, basically saying, hey, you know what? Quoting your data, by the way, this isn't that big a deal. There's not much to march in on. And then on the contrary, the last thing you want to do is turn companies off to the basic research that we do. Because since 1996, according to their letter, technology transfer that Bayh-Dole sponsored basically led to 6.5 million more jobs and contributed $1 trillion to the U.S. gross domestic product. So there are people who say, well, what are we going to get from this investment we're making? How about jobs? How about gross domestic product going up? And this is true for all these kind of investments that the government makes. It can be true for Apple and iPhones and all this stuff.
Well, Google was developed with 2 Department of Defense grants. It's one of the top 10 companies globally. That's marginable. Their patents are marginable.
Can you imagine trying to go buy an iPhone now in an Apple store and saying, well, you know what, I'm a taxpayer and your technology is based
free. My phone's free.
I
want this for free.
Yeah. No, $100.
Negotiate with the government for my iPhone. One of the things, though, that's interesting is, and we stand by this, and I had a debate with Jamie Love on Twitter about this very issue. If you're right, and there are only a limited number of drugs, and we do believe we're right, how can you then say it's going to do scorched earth on the rest of the sector if we march in? And the point is, even if it's a 300-chamber gun and you put 1 bullet in it, nobody's going to pick up the gun.
Well, so here's the real cost of all this, and that is that companies will say, well, you know what, I'm going to learn from this marching thing, and so before I let my discovery scientists work on this project, I want to know, is there any government potential ties to this? Because we won't work on it.
Yeah.
And if you don't believe that, that's what happened when Bayh-Dole was first passed.
Yeah.
A few years after that, Congress came in and said, well, you know what, we want to get payment for this. And so the industry stayed away.
Yeah,
Didn't invest in those things. And it took
Varnes.
Howard Varm is exactly right to come in and say, this is stupid. None of this stuff is getting worked on. It's just sitting here. And he eliminated that.
When they did the CRADAs, the collaborative research grants, they put reasonable pricing clauses in. And when you were at Pfizer, you're like, no, you all stayed away. You stayed away from them 100%. And then as soon as the reasonable pricing clauses were taken out by Varnes, they did a big study. It went up 8 times.
Oh, absolutely.
8x.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's the purpose of government. Should be investing in technology for defense, which is where most of it goes, but for healthcare and for improving people's quality of life. That's what this is. It's not meant to be a fund where we can generate money and by the way, it puts a ton of people to work,
of course,
in this country and supports, and the United States technologically still is the best in the world, and that's due to all this.
How did so many of these academics, politicians, Elizabeth Warren wrote letters, Bernie Sanders wrote letters, they did march-in petitions. I could name several academics in particular who've been front and center. How did they get it so wrong,
They
John?
didn't understand. They knew nothing about R&D. A bunch of us would go to Capitol Hill, and we'd try to talk to various legislators, and we'd try and talk to the Connecticut delegation and stuff. You'd certainly never get the senator. You might get a minute or two with congressional aides. And you try and sit down, and you start with questions like, what is a patent? This is a complicated area, and the oversimplification and the frenzy to try and get in. And I'm going to fix, how many commercials? We're going to fix the drug industry. We're going to not let them get away with murder, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, what happened during the pandemic? Who actually came up with the vaccines and the antiviral compounds in record time and things in the biopharmaceutical industry? And for those who were successful, there were a dozen more who weren't successful, who nevertheless applied to do this sort of thing to try and save the country. And for a brief period of time, for 9 months, the industry's reputation went up and got to where it was in the 90s, and has since dropped back because the attacks go on again. They don't know what they're talking about.
Bernie Sanders and the Help Committee are being very critical of NIH directly on these partnership grants, these CRADAs and intramurals, and they're being very pointed in, well, this is corruption and this isn't right. Those are direct partnerships. I mean, this is a Pfizer or a Gilead or a Merck teaming up directly with the NIH and doing co-development on usually a very cutting-edge platform. What happens if we start going after this, John? I mean, this is a whole different issue altogether. This is order of magnitude.
So
that's really dangerous.
I again think that this is politicians not really understanding a CRADA. A CRADA isn't an exclusive license to anybody. CRADAs could be given for the same idea across the board. It's competitive. That's a great thing. You got a bunch of companies working on something like that, exactly what you want to have happen.
And you're partnered with the government's a partner. They're a direct partner in the deal. Yeah. They get money from this.
Yes. Yep. So that's great to see. I may be naive, but I'm thinking now that these price controls are happening, and unfortunately, but nevertheless happening, and that more and more drugs, the government will be able to point to say, well, you know what, we're setting the price basically for, it's not negotiating, it's price setting for all of these drugs, and it'll go up by 15, 20 a year every year, so that by the end of this decade, there'll be 100 or so, maybe more drugs that are price controls. And we could say, well, look, we've done that. And maybe now they'll turn to something else. Maybe they'll turn to pharmaceutical benefit managers, or maybe even hospital costs along the way.
Well, you mentioned PBMs. What's interesting is the legislation that was being promoted actually was withdrawn this morning. We've been looking at this, some back of the envelope math. We're working on a project. I can't go into too much detail yet. We'll be releasing it. We've capped out of pocket, and that's great. But now you start going after the PBM and the rebates. The only thing left are the actual insurance premiums. And you start cramming down the PBMs. You've already crammed down out of pocket. Again, we agree that's good, but I think some people started realizing, hey, wait a minute, we may have a 120, 140% increase on premiums here, and that's going to be politically untenable.
And hopefully they won't be able to say, well, it's the drug companies raising prices. Because the fact of the matter is drug companies' price increases have been at or below inflation every year for the last 4 or 5 years.
Real profits have been dropping right now.
Exactly right.
They've been dropping
for drug companies.
Yes.
How about the insurance companies? So I think that's where hopefully the focus will be. We'll see.
The reason why there's so much rebate pressure is to try and hold premiums down. Because ultimately, it's not the person going to get a drug on Medicare that's actually, I know it sounds crazy with the out-of-pocket, but that's not actually the client. The client is paying the premiums. It's the companies, it's the premium payers, it's the people in Medicare paying that $110 a month. That's the client.
So insurance companies, PBMs and stuff, want to grow their profits every year, 5 to 10%. What value do they bring? They're not inventing anything. All they're doing is negotiating prices. The spread between what the drug price is and what they're trying to negotiate is just limited. So it has to come back to increasing insurance premiums in order for their profits to go up.
And if you look at Medicare Advantage, John, it's certainly not kept up with inflation. And meanwhile, we have an aging demographic. We have increasing healthcare costs in hospitals, yet insurance has not been keeping pace with inflation. So obviously the rebates, when you were running Pfizer, rebates were about 35-40%. They're up to 60% in aggregate now. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
So where do you think we end up a year now post-election? We're back here. We're making this an annual tradition. It's always nice to see you.
I'll come back. Look, it's hard for me to predict right now. Various pundits think one candidate right now will win and the other. I'm not so sure. A lot can happen in the next six to 8 months. I'm hopeful that price controls that are now being set will diminish the attacks on the industry. Bernie will always attack, right? But I'm hoping when I get a little encouraged when I see this letter that's a bipartisan letter to the president. And by the way, one of the signers was Chris Coons, who's Biden's best friend in the Senate.
Biden supported Bayh-Dole legislation.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Well, a long time
he voted for it.
He voted for it, sure. So I'm hoping that the focus will be off on the industry. We'll see. Because as I said at the outset, both Bernie and Trump felt the industry was getting away with murder, but that'll be 8 years in the past, and hopefully that won't happen now. But again, I tend to be optimistic and naive, so we'll see.
John LaMattina, it's always great to speak with you, sir, and I look forward to doing it again.
Great sessions, great discussions, and I welcome you back whenever you want to come.
Thanks, John. Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2025.